I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Elva Johnston, who's here with us to give a very long-term historical view of the people who lived on this island and their relationship with nature. Elva is an associate professor in the School of History in UCD, and she specialises in early medieval Irish history, and she's going to give us some insights into our past relationships with nature and a short talk on Brehon law, which came before. So please give our first speaker of today, Elva, a very warm welcome.
I'd really like to thank the organisers for inviting me to talk to you this morning. I'm really excited to get the opportunity to present some of the material that I work on to you and see how it might feed into your discussions. So I wanted to start with a voice from early medieval Ireland. And this is from a text known as the Book of Invasions. And the Book of Invasions describes how the ancestors of the Irish came to the island in several waves over time. So the Irish from the very beginning never thought that they were a single ethnic group. They thought they were made up of many different waves of people. And as each wave of people came to the island responded. And as Evan was saying, the land has memory. And as each wave came, the land came into existence. And this is a snapshot from one of these so-called invasions. And in this one, we can see that various features of the landscape come into existence because people name them. And the people themselves become Irish because they're living within that landscape. Now, I'm not going to read through the whole text, but you can see the idea that various plains come into existence. So in Sligo, Wexford, Antrim, Derry, various lakes come into existence. So you've got Loch Mask, Loch Conn, Loch Gara. And for each invasion, the land becomes more and more named, and it becomes more and more inhabited, and it becomes defined. Now, the society that began to grow in early Ireland was one which was dispersed. It was highly rural. Until the arrival of the Vikings, there weren't what we would describe as towns or cities. So the rural life, the life of the farmer, effectively, was the dominant lifestyle on the island. Even though the society was rural and it was dispersed, it was also a society which was bound by rules and by laws. And a complex legal system came into existence known as Brehon law or early Irish law. And in that system, a lot of time is spent looking at land ownership. How do you manage the land? How do you manage the rivers? How do you manage the creatures on the land, domestic animals, but also wild animals? And what I'm going to do for the next few minutes, I know of a short time here, is just introduce you to how they conceptualized and thought about them. One starting point that all of you can do yourselves is look at how the land is named. If you travel around Ireland, if you're going by public transport, if you're going in your car, if you're walking, if you're on a bike, you will pass lots and lots of place names. And these place names will have elements in them like Crow, Drum, Slieve, Queel, Ross, Loch, Inish. And these are the names that were given by the early Irish. And in their legal system, each land type was defined in terms of how it was used, how it was managed, or how it was exploited. So they looked at pasture lands, your ocheds, your clunes, your meadows, your plains. They looked at uplands, your cruach, your drim, your slieve. They looked at woodland. Woodland is very prominent in the material because woodland is both cultivated land, it's land which is used in the farming world, but the woodland can also be the wilderness. So woodland forms a sort of a liminal state. Similarly, when we look at lakes, loch, or inish, the term inish you will see quite a lot. It refers not just to an island, but it refers to any dry land in an area which is less dry. So it's often used for boglands, for bog islands. So an inish in a bog was often seen as very valuable because it was an area of cultivation within an area where cultivation was more difficult. So when you're traveling around the countryside, just look at the names, and those names will give you an insight into what those lands were like in the past. And it's really one of the easiest ways to get a sense of what was it like in the 7th or 8th century. Just look at the place names as you're traveling through them. Now, land is land, but land is also inhabited by animals. So in early Ireland, they have a mixed farming economy. So they're interested in tillage, they're interested in grain, but they're even more interested in livestock. Now, then, as now, the most important livestock are cattle. So cattle have an enormous role in early Irish society. When somebody is given a status in society or in that culture, that status is measured in cattle. So cattle are cattle, but they're also a unit of value. That doesn't mean that they're not looking at other livestock. So we get references to sheep, to pigs, to goats, to fowl. Horses are obviously very important for draft and for transport. They have a special interest in bees and beekeeping. And in early Irish law, there's an entire legal tract. So when they put the rules together, we refer to them as law tracts. And there's an entire legal tract which is dedicated to beekeeping, called the Laws of Bees, Beckfretha. And they look at things such as, if you have a swarm of bees and it goes into a neighbour's property, does that neighbour have a right to some of the honey which the bees create? When a new swarm is created, should that swarm then be gifted to the neighbour? So they look at things in very fine detail. The reason honey is so important, you can use it for alcohol, but it's also one of the very sweet things that they actually have. So, the idea of being sweet, the word that they use, milish, goes back to the word for honey. So it's very important in early medieval Ireland. Dogs have very high status. They're mainly seen as sort of heroic animals, as guard dogs. The greatest Irish hero is Cuchulainn, so that Cú name, the dog name, is very prominent. But as the period goes on, they also introduce lapdogs, and there's a whole story about how the kings of Ireland go to war with each other over who gets the first lapdog to come to the island. They talk about cats. They give cats a particular status, and the highest status cat is one that purrs but also looks after the barn and does its ratting and the rest of it. So, there's a huge amount of rich detail in this material, and they think about animals. But do animals think about people? And I wanted again to give you another voice from early Ireland, not just me interpreting it for you. And this is from probably the most famous of all the early Irish epics, called the Táin. It's basically a glorified cattle rustling event, and it features Queen Maeve, Cuchulainn, and it's sort of the high point of early Irish literature. And at the very beginning of the Táin, Maeve and Ailill, the king and queen of Connacht, are comparing how much property they have. And Maeve has a bull, but the bull decides it doesn't want to be ruled by a woman and goes into her husband's herd. And then that's the starting point for the events that follow. So animals are seen not simply as there to be managed, but also as having some sort of personality. You see it more often, say, with dogs, but you do see it with cattle as well. And I do think this is a particularly nice example. So if you manage the land, and so a lot of the material is about the land, but there is also quite a bit of material on water. How do you manage the water? There's not an awful lot on the ocean. The ocean is seen more as a wilderness than as a resource to be exploited, but they do look a lot at inland waterways, so lakes and rivers, and they think about how can you exploit them. So there's quite a lot about fishing techniques, the use of nets, of weirs, but they're also concerned about overfishing. So they lay down stipulations that if you are at one part of the river, that you can take X amount of fish so that you don't fish it out so somebody further up the river won't actually be able to exploit it. So they've limitations on the size of the catches, on the types of weirs. At the same time, they see high wheels in fishing as a sign of good government. And generally speaking, in a lot of the early Irish material, the better the land is, the healthier the livestock, the fuller the rivers, it means somehow that it's a good ruler. And it's something that runs through all of the material. Now, by far the highest status fish is the salmon. I mean, some of you will have heard the story of the salmon of knowledge, and it just runs through all of the literature. So the salmon of knowledge is at the opening of the Boyne, and it's sort of one of the really iconic Irish stories. So you've got sort of this sense of managing the land, managing the woods, but there's also the sense of wilderness. And when they talk about wilderness, it consists of the ocean. The ocean is the biggest wilderness of all. So when they try to understand what a desert is, so when they're reading about, say, people in the desert or Christianity in the desert, they say, well, our desert is the ocean. So they think of the ocean as a wilderness. It's full of sea monsters. It's difficult to pass. But they also associate the wilderness with bog, with woodlands. It's associated with people outside of society. It's also a place for foraging. It's a place of opportunity. It's a place of asceticism. And it's associated with various animals, such as your wild pig, and especially your wolves. And the wolves are sort of the apex predator. I want to finish up by just saying something about the air above. So we've talked about the ground beneath our feet, the rivers that run through it, and the air above. Birds are an important part of the Irish diet, but birds are also an important part of the mythology. And birds have a very particular status. And as I began, I want to finish with a voice from early Ireland. This is from a beautiful old Irish saga called The Dream of Oengus, and it describes people becoming birds and birds becoming people. And any of you who have heard the story of the children of Lir will recognize this as sort of an earlier version of it. And I felt this has been a very short and I hope sort of interesting description of how the early Irish thought about their land, thought about how to exploit it. And I just want to finish by throwing out a few thoughts. So for the early Irish, the land and its resources were something to be managed. They were very practical about it. But they also recognised that there was a wilderness there which offered both opportunity and danger. I'd love to talk to you more about this, but I'm going to finish up now. And, thanks for listening. And thanks again to the organisers for giving me this opportunity.